And we forget that the purpose of worship, first and foremost, is just to give God glory, because God deserves our praise, right? It's that God is the audience, not the congregation. The congregation are the performers that are performing for an audience of one.
Hi, I'm Phil, and you're listening to Drinks with the Pastor as part of the Imagine Church Ministry Network. Dr. Brannon Hancock is the Assistant Dean of Wesley Seminary and Professor of Practical Theology and Worship. Dr. Hancock feels called to serve God's kingdom by guiding the spiritual and theological formation of individuals and congregation, and has served the local church where he fills the role of pastor and worship leader, shaping worship services that in turn shape the church. Brannon is married to Gloria, and they have 3 children. When he's not reading, writing, or teaching, Brannon is usually found making noise on one of the 11 instruments that he plays, or eating ice cream while watching a movie or TV show with Gloria. All right, so we are here with Dr. Brannon Hancock at Wesley Seminary. Happy to have him here with us. I've been looking forward to this one. So like we start off, usually, Brannon, if you could just take a couple minutes, just introduce yourself. Who are you, and kind of what do you currently do?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, Phil. This is great. And appreciate you doing this podcast and resourcing the church in this way. I serve as assistant dean, and I teach worship and practical theology at Wesley Seminary here at Indiana Wesleyan. I'm in my 8th year full-time and my 11th year, which is kind of hard for me to believe, teaching in some capacity. I started adjuncting here in 2011 as I was serving full-time as a worship pastor at a church in Ohio. I'm ordained in the Church of the Nazarene. So I don't know if you know Nazarenes, but don't hold that against me. You know, we can be a little weird. I grew up not going to movies, because Nazarenes, and not going to school dances and things like that. And so, Nazarenes don't believe in drinking or premarital sex because it leads to dancing. And so you can leave that one in.
I'll leave that in.
And so I come from a line of Nazarene pastors. My dad's a pastor, and his brothers are in ministry, and his dad was a pastor and a district superintendent in our tribe. And so I'm on loan to the Wesleyans to teach at their seminary, but I lead worship at our local Nazarene church here in Marion, Indiana, which is because of the university, a very Wesleyan town in terms of the Wesleyan holiness church presence. There's lots of larger Wesleyan churches, but so we have like one little Nazarene church, and that's my church. We run about 100, and my wife and I work with college students and teach a Sunday school class and lead worship there every week. And yeah, it's great. We have 3 kids. I grew up in the Nashville, Tennessee area. Used to travel with a Christian rock band that was epically underrated in its time in the late 90s. Did a couple albums that you could have bought in Christian bookstores back when there were Christian bookstores that sold CDs and things like that, and even cassettes. I know that we had our albums were released on cassette tape, late 90s. Yeah, I play guitar and saxophone. You and I have a lot in common on the music front, instrumental front, and that's probably enough.
That's great.
Blab about myself.
Cassettes. I mean, I owned cassettes, so I remember making mixtapes off the radio.
Yeah,
you'd wait and hope and hit record right at the right time. Right
Absolutely.
at the right time.
Absolutely.
One of the questions I always ask, because people in different spaces and whatnot, is the biggest surprise that you've had in the last year, ministry, personal, kind of just what's something in your life that surprised you in the last year? Maybe it's something God showed up in or whatnot. And then we'll get into some stuff about worship. Yeah,
well, the biggest surprise of the last year, and if I could expand it out to a year and a half and just think about COVID in general, and maybe this does kind of connect to worship in a way. I've been really surprised at what the pandemic has. We focused a lot on the negatives and all the things that it's prevented us from doing, and maybe at best tried to see the upside as like God giving us all a timeout, and just kind of a pause to have to slow down and reconnect with our families and things like that. And that's certainly an upside. But like I've been really amazed and surprised by the creative output that I've seen, and that I think the pandemic even brought about in me. And being a musician, I've noticed it particularly on that front, people that that don't typically put a lot of their own artistry out there on the internet or on social media, suddenly being stuck at home and realizing like, man, I can just like turn on my cell phone and play the guitar and put that on Instagram or put it on Facebook, or churches creatively finding ways to connect people when they can't meet in person, whether that's worshiping outdoors, whether that's buying streaming equipment so that we can put services online. My little church of 100 never would have started live streaming our services if it weren't for the pandemic. And so the creative initiatives to continue to kind of bring positivity and connection and relationship and art, not just musical art, but visual art, the art of, relational connection, I think has been really encouraging to me and surprising to me. Again, people starting podcasts and doing things that are just new creative endeavors that have come into being that wouldn't have if it weren't for the kind of crisis that we were all facing. One of my favorite books that I've read probably 4 or 5 times now, it has nothing to do with theology or worship or anything, but it's called The War of Art, play on Sun Tzu's The Art of War. But it's Stephen Pressfield, who's a novelist, and it's a book called The War of Art, and he's it's kind of a encouragement to conquer your creative blocks and do the thing that you have in you to do, whatever that might be. And he defines art broadly, like anything that you would do that would make the world around you a better place. Like that could be starting a business, writing a novel, making an album, starting a diet, that we don't think of that as art, but things that you would do that would enhance the world around you. And every time you do that, you're going to face resistance. So he personifies resistance in a really interesting way and like frames it so you can kind of see it as this bully that wants to keep you from bringing to birth that thing, and how to stand up to it and how to get past it and continue on your creative journey. Great little book. I reread it during COVID. Yeah, The War of Art by Stephen Pressfield. Anyway.
No, that's great. The War of Art. Oh, can you hear me? Is that working? Yeah. Okay, great. Mm-hmm. Perfect. It looked, my lights were acting weird. Okay. The War of Art. Awesome. No, I agree with that whole creative thing. To see it was the first or second kind of week of March of 2020 when really everything went haywire. And, a lot of people started to use, what is it called? It's like not a streaming service, but it was like a streaming overlay. You could push your stream to it. It's like Church Online software or something that it's church made. And that second week, so many churches hopped onto it that it crashed. It crashed the servers. Like it totally just stopped working, which is a testament to churches finding a way to strive on. That we crashed the internet.
Yeah,
that's great. So what I want to talk to you about is kind of a broad topic, but worship for churches and church leaders, kind of to help clarify some things, to maybe look at some tips and different things churches can do to maybe grow in their worship, their sense of worship, not just music, but the whole thing, the liturgy, the whole shebang. So before I start defining things and throwing out big words, in your words, what is worship in a church setting, or in Christianity? What's worship? And then why is that important? Why is it something that we should be, looking at in our churches?
Yeah. So when I teach worship, I tend to start with, combating, this sounds like I'm starting negative, but combating a kind of individualist and highly privatized understanding of worship that I think a lot of, at least modern Western evangelicals tend to come in as their default. So we tend to think of worship as this personal or private thing that I do, and I would say that worship is personal. It needs to be personal. Even corporate worship still needs to be personal, but it's never private. The Christian faith is not a private thing. It's sort of like, this is my business and nobody else's business. What we're doing when we become Christian is giving our assent and our permission, not just to a set of doctrines, but to a higher authority that tells us kind of what to do with our lives and what to do with our time and what to do with our bodies and our money. But that it's not up to me. I don't just live for myself. That's what it means to be crucified with Christ. So I often try to start the conversation with conceiving of worship not as first and foremost kind of the thing I do in my private devotions or singing along with Caleb in my car or something like that, but what the body of Christ does when it gathers together as the kind of physical instantiation of Christ's presence sourced by the Spirit here on earth while Christ is seated at the right hand of the Father, right? So what worship is the church gathered to glorify God, following after the example of Jesus that we see in Scripture, constantly being obedient, saying yes to pouring his life out in obedience to God for the life of the world. And that's what we do in worship. And so it's not just singing, it's not just and of course it isn't just what we do for that hour or so on Sunday morning. It flows out into the rest of life, and so it is both personal and corporate. It is both day to day and gathered on the weekend. One of my friends, Brent Peterson, who teaches worship at one of our Nazarene schools in Idaho, he talks about how God breathes the church in for worship or for communion, and then breathes the church out into the world for mission. And that's kind of the rhythm of the Christian life. The purpose of gathered worship is to be scattered for mission. The purpose of being scattered for mission is to draw all people into the worshiping life of the church. So we have to have a broader definition than just like, oh, it's the songs we sing or whatever. I hope that's a good starting point. I probably should have a shorter elevator speech when somebody says, so what is worship, Mr. Worship Professor? But I immediately go into like some of my lectures. Sorry about that.
Your elevator speeches are they're lectures, and that's okay. That's why we like it. I love it. We were talking in a class the other day. We said, don't get Brannon started on something because it'll be dinner before he's made his point on it. So, but no, it's great. So what you're saying is, I'm going to try to just see if I got what you said here. It's not just the time that we're gathered, but it also is what extends in through the week. So if we think of worship as just Sunday, we'd be missing what we're supposed to be doing through the week.
Yeah, sure.
And it's also more than just the time of singing. It involves anything. The word anything scares me. It involves all the things that we would do that are an action of glorification to God.
Yeah, I think, I like to think of worship. This isn't a word that I grew up with in my Nazarene context, but when I started to study this in my graduate school process and started exploring liturgy and the history of Christian liturgy, that word has to do with kind of a public service. It has a secular use outside of just religious ritual. So there are liturgies of the state, even back into the ancient world, the way that a soldier would swear his oath to the emperor to serve the empire. There was even when we think of like sacrament, for instance, we think of that as baptism, communion, whatever, religious ritual. But even in the ancient world, that oath was called a sacramentum. It was not just a symbolic, but an even more deeply powerful act, and those are liturgical acts. And so thinking of worship as liturgy, this public service that's kind of the work of the people in service of the greater good, means that when we gather, it's not, every aspect of the service is worship. The preaching and our listening to the preaching is worship. Our fellowship, Acts 2 talks about how they came together on the first day of the week for the apostles' teaching, the fellowship, the breaking of bread, and the prayers. Doesn't say anything about singing songs, And so that's what they did when they gathered. I think you can do worship probably without music. I would, that wouldn't be my preference, but I think you can have worship, gathered worship without music, that still fulfills those four things: the fellowship, the teaching, the apostles' teaching, the breaking of bread, the prayers. The whole service is a prayer in a certain sense, from start to finish, offered up to God. And in that context, we offer praises. And it's a fitting human expression to offer those praises in the form of music. And so that's why we do that. It's one of the best ways we've come up with over religious history to offer praise to our God or our gods, even in other pre-Christian traditions.
Yeah. So with that, I guess one of the things that I think about is if you're in a church, and I don't know if it was you that said it, but I use this here at Columbia City. I always talk about somebody one time, and if it wasn't you, you can just still take credit for it. I don't really care. Said, I've been to churches where there's beautiful praying, there's beautiful singing, there's sermon delivered from the word, there's response, there's fellowship, and then they hit a pause button and do the offering, as if worship stops, right? So one of the things I say is, like, this is an act of worship. This is still a continuation of what we've been doing. So
Right.
how do you instill this sense, not just with the offering, right? That's just my example that I use here to try to push that in here. But how do you kind of instill that worshipful sense that from the moment that you step foot to the moment that you step out, every act that we're doing in here is worship, not just the singing? How do you kind of work that worshipful attitude into some of those other elements of the service? How do you kind of bring a congregation along into this sense of making all of these actions worshipful?
Yeah, and it even really begins, because it flows from there into all of life and then back into gathered worship, right? Like, you could think of worship beginning like when I go to bed on Saturday night, like I'm resting so that I can then get up and go to work, not just because I'm the worship pastor and I have a job to do, like an actual job up on the platform to do, but because all of the people of God, liturgy is work. It's the work of the people. Which is interesting because we often think it, like, we talk about Sunday as the Lord's Day, and which is right and appropriate, right? Jesus rose on Sunday, on the last day of the week, or I mean on the first day of the week, but in creation, God rested on the last day of creation, right? And so we confuse sometimes Sabbath and Lord's Day. We think of, like, well, it's a Lord's Day, so it needs to be a day of rest. But, like, our worship is our work, right? So it's actually a day of work. We need to have Sabbath as well. And I'm all for, like, finishing up my work on Sunday morning and then going home and resting and taking my Nazarene nap. Like, I can do both. But how we prepare, like when I'm getting up and getting my kids ready and getting out the door, and like all of that is, prelude to the church's gathered worship. So it's part of what I'm offering up, so to speak, right? Because, like, I bring all that with me. And I think this is something that, the first thing that comes to mind to respond to your question is just the language that we use is so important, to try to instill this in a congregation. I do think from time to time it's helpful to just teach about it from the pulpit, or to have, opportunities, whether it's in another discipleship setting or something, to talk about this and to try to teach deeply on it. But just the way that the liturgy itself teaches week to week is forming our understanding of what worship is. So it's really problematic, I think, when somebody gets up on Sunday morning and says, okay, before we worship, here's a couple of announcements, and then now we're going to pray, and, like, all right, now let's start our worship, right? Like, because again, then you're just reinforcing that, like, that stuff, the announcements, the invocation, whatever, like, those things were not worship. And now the guitar player starts strumming, and so now this is worship, right? Mm-hmm. And that kind of carelessness with language that reinforces some of those negative, not negative, but just kind of misconstrued understandings of what's happening in worship are important. And this is where I think I'm used to a tradition that's pretty extemporaneous and conversational. That's not, everything scripted out in a liturgy, like a written liturgy. But this is where a good liturgy helps us, I think, not be careless in those ways. I'm all for, for being casual and conversational in worship and not being like overly, I don't know, whatever you want to call it, like kind of highbrow. I love high scripted liturgy as well. I love going to the Episcopal Church and getting to experience that from time to time. But that's not my tradition in the Church of the Nazarene. But I still think we need to be conscientious about the language that we use. And yeah, not kind of grinding the gears in the middle of the service, acting like the offering is, okay, we interrupt your regularly scheduled worship service to now ask for money, like, no, that's not what we're doing. This isn't like announcements aren't a commercial break. Like they're part of the missional life of the church. We announce things that are about like what we're doing in the community, how people are coming together for groups and activities, that like these are the things we announce. So they're connected to mission, they're connected to our common life. They're not an interruption. Even when we pause to recognize somebody's like 50th wedding anniversary or something like that, in a service. Some people say, oh, well, it should all be about God and not spotlighting, that couple. But it's like, well, what are we doing? We're giving God praise for his faithfulness to empower this couple to be faithful to their wedding vows for 50 years and celebrating that as part of our common life and giving God the glory for that. And you can do it in a way that overly spotlights the individual or or something human, or that is deflecting that praise back to God. And the same, like you said, with the offering, it's not just pausing to ask for money, but saying, this is part of our worship. It's forming generosity in us to contribute to God's work here in the world through the church, and how we fund the mission and the ministry of the church. And so it's part of our worship as well. So I'm constantly, like, probably to an annoying degree on a Sunday morning, saying, let's continue our worship. Let's continue, when we move into the next, because I'm often the one making those transitions. I'll say, let's continue our worship as we move into a time of prayer, or, now as we continue our worship and turn our attention to the word, let's prepare our hearts to receive the message this morning, things like that.
Yeah, the language, kind of that language that you're using sets that tone, which I like that. Let's continue. I think at one point I said, I know you guys are tired of me saying we're going to continue in worship when we do this, but I think we got to keep reinforcing it. The one thing I liked you said too is you talked about like announcements are not a commercial break. It's here's how our mission is here's how we're doing the mission in this community, right? And so I think the way that you talk about some of those other things that maybe don't seem like we wouldn't group them in as worship is just as important. In preaching class, they say when you're preaching, watch your pronouns. If you say the word you a lot, you're probably not, you're putting yourself in a different position than the people you're speaking to. So saying a lot of us and we's, kind of including yourself in people that need to learn, can help. But also in that same sense, watching your pronouns, quote unquote, when you're talking about different elements of worship. So, hey, we're going to talk about announcements. I know nobody likes it, but these are important things we got to know about. The UMW has a rummage sale later this week. And instead of that, saying, one of the things we're called to do is in our mission statement, or blank, 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 and turning that phrase into one that glorifies God and reinforces why it's important that you do those things is important. If that summarizes what you said, pretty okay.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And I think, we do, we even, I think with the sacraments, I grew up in a tradition that when I was really young, probably only did communion maybe 4 times a year, quarterly. And then I remember like as a teenager, my dad started doing it a little more regularly, and it became more of a monthly practice. My dad's a pastor, so he was making those decisions, and it was long before I got interested in sacramental theology. But like, it always seemed like a deviation from our normal thing. We'd have to have like a communion service, and everything had to sort of be focused around communion, sort of singing all the blood songs and, cross songs and everything had to be focused on communion. And I remember at my church in Ohio, we we made a transition pretty cold turkey from quarterly communion to weekly communion. So it wasn't a ramp up, and it wasn't we're going to explain this and teach about it for weeks and get everybody ready for it. We just started doing it every week, and how we did it evolved over time. We started out doing it at kind of in between the music and the sermon. Our pastor would do like a pastoral prayer time, and we would make communion available during that time. And then eventually I convinced him to like, let's shift this to the end of the service so that it's actually the response to the preaching of the word every week. You know, in our tradition, we have a long history of giving altar calls, and like coming forward to receive communion is an altar call. It's, you know, being invited to step out and come and kneel and receive and participate in Christ's sacrifice in that particular way. And so we moved it to the end of the service, but only after the pastor and I had a lot of conversations about, he said, so does that mean like every sermon I preach needs to drive towards communion and the cross? What if I'm preaching about finances, or what if I'm preaching a series on like family or communication or something like that? And I just kind of, as diplomatically as possible, said, I think if you're preaching a sermon that you can't find some way to like turn it towards the cross and towards the table, like it probably isn't a sermon that should be preached in a service of Christian worship, you know. And I probably said it a little more diplomatically than that, but like can you not think of some way to take a sermon about finances and move it toward, you know, Christ's poured out sacrifice, you know, for the life of the world that we memorialize and participate in the bread and the cup, you know, like it can't be that hard, right? To turn every sermon towards the cross as the basis for what we're doing in the Eucharist. But I didn't even really think of communion as an act of worship growing up. It was just kind of like this strange little devotional thing that we did with a little thimbleful of grape juice and a little stale cracker. And I'm supposed to feel bad about what Jesus did on my behalf or something like that, rather than like seeing it as the church's participation in Christ making himself present to us through those elements in a real and tangible way. So that's been part of my journey too, is to come to see, you know, our listening to the sermon as an act of worship, our giving in the offering, our participation in communion and baptism, you know, even the congregation's participation and witness to someone else's baptism as an act of worship, and remembering our own baptism as they're baptized into the faith. Like those are all important acts of worship.
What do you think the biggest challenge for you know, you're a pastor in a smaller church, you know, maybe you're solo, what's sort of the biggest challenge that a pastor would face in kind of growing that worshipful attitude? How could they kind of overcome sort of the like, all right, I only have 40 hours a week, or, you know, whatever you want to say. There's only 24 hours a day. I'm here alone. I've got to preach. I've got to do pastoral visits. How do I make my time of worship on Sunday from beginning to end, including the sermon? How do I bridge that, make that a little cleaner and better? What are some tips you could maybe throw out to pastors to kind of overcome some of those difficult challenges of time and money or skill availability around the area?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest challenge that I hear about when I'm teaching or, you know, at conferences that, you know, when I actually have a workshop that I've done at a handful of conferences called something like maximizing the strengths of smaller churches in worship. It's not a very catchy title, but something like that. And people always come because they're like, we don't have any musicians, or we don't have any, you know, like we have no budget for technology or whatever it might be, right? Those are often the stresses, like lack of resources, like human resources, lack of financial and technical resources. And I deeply sympathize with that and know that it's a real challenge. And I think that sometimes one of the best things that pastors can do is just to really simplify what they're doing on Sunday morning and try to again have a shape that that orders what you do. So like when I plan worship, we use Planning Center Online, which is a subscription service that I've been using for, I don't know, 10 or 12 years now, since it was a pretty new product. And I don't know how we lived without it when we made service plans in Word documents and sent them around to everybody or whatever, printed them out, typed them up, and used the mimeograph machine way back in the 80s. I don't know, I guess it was before my time, but I'm thankful for Planning Center. And I have a template that basically has 4 headings. And so it's like, we gather for worship, we proclaim the word, we respond to the word, and then we're sent forth, or we're dismissed. The reason Catholics call it the Mass is because it has everything to do with the dismissal, like being sent out on mission. The missa part of dismissal and mission are the word that we get Mass from. And so it's interesting that they call their whole service Mass, which means like being sent out on mission, right? So those 4 acts are I think really important, at least to how I think about planning worship. And so everything that we do when we gather, we acknowledge God's presence. We open with prayer, with scripture, sometimes with announcements, although sometimes we save them for a different part of the service. And then as we sing and as we hear the word preached, like that's all proclaiming the word. So we proclaim the word. The prayers that we do at that time, we always have the kids in our service at the beginning during the singing, and then they go out for children's church right before the sermon, but our pastor brings them up front and prays over them, and then they leave and go to a different room to receive their lesson. Except for once a month they stay in, and that's the last Sunday of the month when we do communion. So they stay in and hear the sermon, and we have communion at the end of the service. So communion is one of the ways we respond to the word. So after we've sang and heard the preaching, then we respond. And sometimes that involves communion or another song that we might sing in response, or sometimes that's where we do the offering as an active response, or an altar call, or baptism, or a baby dedication, or there's all kinds of different ways that we might respond. Before then we receive the benediction and we're sent out as part of the dismissal. So just simplifying our structure and then thinking about participation, I think, is another key that I would try to encourage, especially solo pastors or pastors of smaller churches. How many different ways are you involving the congregation, and particularly encouraging like bodily participation in worship through, not just stand up and sing, sit down and listen, but are there other ways that they can be involved? Do you ever throw out a question in the sermon and just say, hey, take 90 seconds and turn to somebody next to you and talk about this while I take a sip of my coffee or something? How can you engage them in a different ways that kind of keep us active participants and not just passive spectators? And that same principle in terms of leadership as well. You don't have to do everything. You don't have to pray every prayer or read every scripture. Delegate that. Have somebody get up and lead the prayer time, or read the scripture, or give the announcements, or receive the offering. Have lay people in the congregation take leadership over some of those aspects of the service. Those are just some things that come to mind that I think sometimes we overburden worship. That I kind of think of it like this, that there's 4 principal tasks of the church to fulfill its mission, and so I categorize those as worship, discipleship, evangelism, and compassion. Sometimes we think of mission as just like the kind of compassionate acts that we do. I think all 4 of those things together, worship, discipleship, evangelism, and compassion, together make up the mission of the church. But my concern as a worship guy a lot of times is that we treat the worship service as the place where we're doing our primary efforts in discipleship and the place where we're doing our primary efforts in evangelism. So we want the gathered worship service to be the place where like lost people might get saved, and where the saints are being primarily discipled in their own faith. And we forget that the purpose of worship, first and foremost, is just to give God glory, because God deserves our our praise, right? It's that God is the audience, not the congregation. The congregation are the performers that are performing for an audience of one. And so we overlaid in the service with things that are for us, or for people, or for, or for evangelistic purposes, or for discipleship purposes, that ideally would be happening in other contexts as well outside. Of course, people can get saved in a worship service. Thanks be to God, right? Of course, gathered worship contributes to our discipleship. So like, yes, it overlaps with discipleship and with evangelism, but it shouldn't be the primary focus, right, of gathered worship. Anyway,
What are some things you could point pastors to kind of maybe help them maybe learn more about creating service liturgy, those sort of things, like books, podcasts, TED Talks, that they could go to and say, hey, this is really great to help you structure your worship, to maybe dive in to see how you could make something more worshipful, or to kind of engage with this topic a little deeper?
I mean, of course, as a teacher and scholar, a whole list of books comes to mind right away. But the ones that I use in our seminary classes that you'll be familiar with, of course, Phil, but are Constance Cherry's books. She taught here at Indiana Wesleyan for I think 16 years or so. She just retired last year. But she has a really great book that's just been reissued in its second edition called The Worship Architect. That's just a really good read, very accessible. That flows out of a couple decades of teaching, as well as a couple decades before that of being a church musician and a worship director. So I really admire her and her work. It's almost kind of frustrating as a scholar, because like she's sort of already written the book that I would want to write if it didn't already exist, and so I just endorse her book and encourage people to read it. My friend Timothy Brooks has a book out called the Transformational Power of Worship. Do I have a copy of it handy? I'm afraid I'm getting the name wrong. Well, I guess I have the internet. I could look it up. It's either the formational power of worship or the transformational power of worship. And he gets into kind of how we use not just the time that we have in worship, but how we also engage culture within worship. Yeah, the formational power of worship, leading your community with intention. And it's a real handy little short book written for pastors. He's a pastor, and it flowed out of his doctoral work, and I was involved in kind of supervising some of his doctoral research. But he talks about how Malcolm Gladwell's principle of the 10,000 hour rule, of like becoming an expert or a master of a particular discipline. And he just kind of ran some quick math and said, like, if all you did was go to church on Sunday for like your entire, say, 80 years of life, you wouldn't hit the 10,000 hour mark in terms of mastery of Christian liturgy or Christian worship. If that's the only place that you're kind of practicing your faith, so to speak. Whereas by comparison, we're out in the world and participating in the kind of liturgies of secular culture all the time. So how would we ever win, so to speak, against the culture in terms of how we're being formed through the liturgies of our lives, right? And so one of the arguments that he makes is around how we engage culture in the context of worship, so that when we go back out into the world, things that we're doing, watching, engaging with in culture become reminders of our faith and of our discipleship. Like if we can, with the amplifying power of the Holy Spirit, kind of redeem some of those practices, stories, symbols, rituals, whether it's sports or movies or, how we engage online, all those things can be redeemed and brought into the discipleship process and brought into even what we do on Sunday mornings, so that the power of what we do in that concentrated time on Sunday morning continues to have power out in the everyday moments of our lives. So that's a handy book. Yeah, is that enough? I don't know.
That's good.
Yeah, probably come
two
up with
books.
That's two books. It's
two whole books.
Yeah, and I should say, yeah, go ahead.
Constance is, the worship architect. Someone I know got hired in as a worship person at a church. I was like, just buy this book, just read
Yeah.
it. Like,
Well, and I should put in a plug too that she also has like the architect theme is kind of a series that she's done with Baker. So she has a book called The Music Architect that's more specifically like it goes deeper into particularly how we use music in worship. And it's really great. I use it in another class that I teach that's on music and the arts and worship. And then she has one called The Special Services Architect that's kind of dealing with communion and baptism and weddings and funerals and things like that that are not maybe our just every Sunday morning worship, but other special services. And I think anything, a book that really transformed my thinking around the sacraments. I mean, I'm always encouraging people to read kind of outside their own theological tradition. And so I've gained a whole lot from reading Eastern Orthodox and Catholic authors on worship and on sacraments. And so Alexander Schmemann, Schmemann, is an Eastern Orthodox theologian who's written this book called For the Life of the World about sacraments. Is a chapter on what for the Eastern Orthodox tradition, there's 7 sacraments, not just baptism and communion, but he talks about marriage and ordination and confession and sacrament of healing, unction. He goes further than just the Protestant sacraments. But that book was really impactful in my understanding of how God works through the created order in administering grace to us through the sacraments.
Nice. I'll definitely have to reference you spelling that name to put it in the bottom of the video description here.
Yeah.
Last thing, it's the last word. So kind of Brannon's last word about worship, either something you want people to definitely know or something I forgot to ask you about that you want to make sure people hear. It's Brannon's last word.
I have heard people say that going to church doesn't make you a Christian any more than like hanging out in the garage makes you a car, something like that. Have you heard that?
I've heard
that type of an analogy. And but I would say that like if you wanted to be somebody who knew about cars, you'd probably spend some time in the garage and probably with somebody who knew more than you about cars. So I think that if we want people to have lives that reflect Christ and that look discernibly Christian in the midst of a culture that doesn't have any real clue what that means or what that looks like, they need to get around other Christians and spend time in church and learn the practices of the faith.
I love it. Brannon, thanks so much for joining, and hope to see you again soon. That's it for this episode of Drinks with a Pastor as part of the Imagine Church Ministry Network. Make sure that you subscribe to our podcast to stay up to date with all of our episodes, as well as check out our YouTube channel for other instructional videos and church tours so that we can continue to imagine church ministry together.